Greetings everyone, Ben here from The Virtual Economist, and welcome to part 7 in my unusual trading guide. So far in the series we have gone over unusual tier levels, how to buy quick sells, and how to make unusual offers with all three major types of unusuals. At this point I'm going to try and bring everything together. That is, for the next 2 episodes I'm going to talk about some overarching trading strategies that you guys can employ to make profit in unusual trading. The reason I'm going to be talking about this for 2 videos is just because there is actually so much to talk about regarding this topic, and I really can't go very in depth on this if I try to condense it all into one video. Thus, I'm going to split this topic into 2 episodes, with this first one talking about a little bit simpler strategies, with the second one finishing it off with more complex methods, as well as talking about when to use each one. Alright, so without further ado, let's get right on into the video. Now, I've actually sort of introduced the concept of trading strategies previously in the series, back in episodes 4 and 5. In episode 4, I talked about the trading strategy of knowing what unusuals to re-quick sell or list for backpack.tf price, and in episode 5, I showed you guys the basic method of making profit with unusual offers, either by selling your unusual for more keys than what you paid for it or for an overpay offer. Now, as you can imagine, these are pretty simplistic trading strategies. While they work great for explaining the essence of buying quick sells and making offers, they certainly aren't an all-encompassing way to trade unusuals and aren't always applicable in all cases. Thus, as you guys can probably guess, I'm going to get way more in depth into trading strategies in these next 2 videos. For now, let's start by talking about what I consider to be the 2 most basic unusual trading strategies. You see, no matter what you are doing, you will be taking advantage of either one or both of these strategies, namely being either proactive or non-proactive. If you're confused by what I mean by this, these strategies just refer to whether you have to be the one going out of your way to make trades or not. In a proactive strategy, you certainly will, and in a non-proactive strategy, you really won't. And that brings me to my basic strategy number 1. Being non-proactive in selling your unusuals. Now, you might not realize it at first, but to me the one and only textbook example of a non-proactive strategy is actually just listing your items and letting them sit on the classifieds. You see, like I just talked about, a non-proactive strategy is just the method of not going out of your way to find trades, and when you just list your items on backpack.tf, you're really expecting people to come to you and make the first offer themselves. Now, if you've seen my extra videos on how to negotiate, you'll remember that I said that receiving the first offer is very advantageous because it guarantees that your trading partner has a high interest in your items and is probably willing to make a deal worth your time. So, if you're looking for people to give you high profit margins with good, pure, or overpay offers, you will almost certainly find them by waiting for your unusuals to sell on the classifieds. In addition, with good items, you can be very picky about offers, since you will just have all the time in the world to wait for the perfect one. However, because this technique involves waiting around, it is relatively slow and more long-term oriented. I also think it is worth pointing out that unless you update your classified listings daily, it is really easy to get undercut and it is basically impossible to avoid price suggestions lowering your unusuals. Most importantly though, if you've tried unusual trading for even just a little bit of time, you've probably listed an item on backpack.tf only to get absolutely 0 offers. This is because, and this is very, very important, this strategy simply does not work with bad, risky, or even quite mid-range unusuals due to the greater amount of sellers compared to potential buyers. While you should always list your unusuals on the classifieds no matter what, you shouldn't be put off when you don't get any offers. If that is the case, you need to apply the opposite technique, in my opinion what is the second basic unusual trading strategy, being proactive. Now, you might look at the title of this strategy and think that it is quite vague. However, it is that way on purpose. To be honest, there's only really one non-proactive strategy, and that is just waiting for your items to sell in the classifieds. Almost every other method that I'm going to be talking about in this video or in the next one are actually going to be quite proactive techniques, and they're really all just going to be sub-strategies of this one. Thus, keeping this in mind, I'm going to try to keep this description semi-all-encompassing so that it applies to all of the methods that I will discuss next. Anyway, just like I briefly mentioned, in proactive strategies, you need to be the one going out of your way, and that means making offers on other people's classified listings or going on unusual trading servers. Because of this initiative, you will typically sell items much faster, and you can also take more risk by trading for obviously horrible items, since you should be able to liquidate them much quicker. You also need to consider that you usually won't find the person who can give you the absolute most for your unusuals, since if you initiate trades, it isn't as likely that you will find someone who wants your stuff really badly. Of course, this means you will typically have lower profit margins being proactive, but you will also make more trades, so if done correctly, this should negate the downside of smaller amounts of profit. You should also be able to sell almost any unusual, whether it is good or bad, so if you do have a poor unusual, you definitely want to be doing this over waiting for it to sell in the classifieds every single time. I also do think it is worth pointing out that if you want to take these strategies to the next level, it really does help to be good at negotiation, since you will often find yourself in situations when you need to make a sales pitch in order to convince someone to take your items. Unfortunately, these methods do take a lot of time, so you will ultimately need to consider whether the upsides are worth the effort you will have to put into selling your items proactively. But in a lot of situations, I certainly do think that it is worth it. For example, for newer traders especially, I would recommend these strategies because they prevent you from simply waiting around when you have only a small amount of capital. Alright, so at this point I think we better get into the more specific strategies. Like I mentioned before, these are really only going to be proactive strategies, so just keep that in mind from here on forward. Also, to help narrow in on the pros and cons of each of these techniques, for each of these strategies that I talk about, I will also rate each one on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of difficulty, profitability, speed, and risk. Alright, so without further ado, let's jump right on into these. Strategy number 1. Quick buying and quick selling. I would rate this a 1 out of 5 difficulty, a 2 out of 5 profitability, a 4 out of 5 speed, and a 2 out of 5 risk. Now, as you can probably gather from the name, to pull off this strategy, you basically need to buy quick sells with pure keys, and then just re-quick sell them. To make profit, all you need to do is quick sell your unusual for even just a little bit more than what you paid for it, and boom, you should be able to net at least a key in your favor. To be honest, this is probably the best strategy for new people getting into unusual trading, simply because it isn't very risky and it works very well with a low amount of capital. If you have around 10 to 30 keys pure, it works like a charm since you will usually be dealing with unusuals that are relatively easy to get pure for. Just buy an unusual for around 30 to 40% off, and then just re-quick sell it for maybe 25 to 30% off. Just keep in mind that the more expensive of an unusual you have, the harder it will be to re-quick sell simply because there are less people with the keys necessary to afford them. Thus, if you're spending say 50 keys pure on a quick sell, you probably want to buy at least 35% off to reduce the risk of not finding a buyer. From my experience, for this to work most optimally, you need to idle on unusual trade servers and search for quick sells and quick buyers out there on the classifieds. Of course, this means you'll have to devote a lot of time to finding buyers and sellers, and it will often seem frustrating when you don't get any trades after sitting on a server for a couple of hours. You also need to make sure to relist your classified listings very frequently to make it look like your quick sell is fresh on the market, as really nobody's going to buy your quick sell no matter the discount if it has been unsold for a week. That being said, quick buying and quick selling is still a great strategy for making profit, since you can get it to work with pretty much any type of unusual, whether it is horrible or not, as long as you just up the percent discounts. It also makes it really easy to cash out, since you will always have pure on you. In fact, this was the strategy that I used almost exclusively to buy my computer, and it worked out pretty well since I had a huge stash of pure lying around when I needed to cash out. Strategy number 2. Transitioning bad unusuals to good items. I would rate this a 3 out of 5 difficulty, a 3 out of 5 profitability, a 1 out of 5 speed, and a 3 out of 5 risk. If you just go off the title of this strategy, you might think that it is pretty straightforward. Just trade your bad unusuals for better ones and make easy profit. While you wouldn't be 100% incorrect with that statement, this strategy inherently doesn't guarantee profit at all, and there's actually a lot more to this than just getting better unusuals. You see, when I was talking about listing items on the classifieds, I noted that it was far more profitable than going out and making offers yourselves. However, on the flip side, I also said that it doesn't work at all when you have bad unusuals. Thus, to me, the point of this strategy is to make offers that slowly transition your bad unusuals into good unusuals that you can get offers on by just listing them on the classifieds. This way, you can pretty much negate the biggest downside with a non-proactive strategy, and you can reap the benefits of better offers on every single one of your unusuals. Anyway, at this point, I think we should get into the methodology of this strategy. First though, you need to find unusuals that are better than yours to offer on. To do this, I would either jump onto unusual trading servers, or look through the backpack.tf classifieds. To perform the latter, all you gotta do is just go onto backpack.tf, go to trading, then classified listings, and then change the search to search for unusuals. Then what you have to do is change the page number in the URL until you find unusuals priced at around the price of your unusual, maybe plus or minus a few keys. You don't need to go super in depth on each unusual, but you should determine a rough tier level for each one, and just go ahead and add people to discuss who have items that are better than yours. Now, you need to go about making an offer to get one of these more desirable unusuals. From my experience, there are actually a number of different techniques to do this, a lot of which I actually briefly mentioned in my episode on unusual offers. However, for the sake of clarity, I'm going to go over each one again in this video, hopefully going a little bit more in depth on each one, as you could arguably say that these are trading strategies in and of themselves. Technique number 1. offering an equal value trade for a better unusual. Of course, this is the best case scenario. Just go through the pros and cons of each person's unusual, and if you think your trading partner's is better, just go ahead and offer a 1-for-1 trade. While sometimes you can actually snag a deal like this, a lot of the time people will just flat out decline you since you're simply offering them a bad trade. So in that case, just move on to one of the following methods. Technique number 2, overpaying on a better unusual. To be honest, I feel like too many people just discount this as an instant way to lose profit. However, this can often be further from the truth. As I've talked about in past episodes, a more expensive unusual does not correlate it with it being easier to sell, so by appeasing the profit trader inside the other party with a few keys overpay, you can often get a great deal trading for an unusual that is, in a tier sense, a strict upgrade from yours. Technique number 3, downgrading an expensive unusual. For those who are unclear what downgrading is, it is basically the process of selling your one unusual for 2 or more of your trading partner's hats. Now, the way I see it, downgrading is inherently good for transitioning bad unusuals into better ones, simply because for most items, the more expensive your unusual is, the harder it is to sell for any type of offer because there are fewer people that can actually afford it. Thus, the point of downgrading is getting your more expensive unusuals to a few cheaper items that should theoretically be easier to sell due to their lower price. So if you get an expensive unusual that just isn't selling well, you should try to find people to negotiate with on your friends list or on trade servers and see if any of them are willing to do maybe a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 for your unusual. However, the problem with this is that the way the TF2 market works right now, I would say that downgrading is inherently good for everyone, so you will probably find it hard to get a straight 1 for 2 of equal value. In this case, you're going to need to pull out the overpay card once again to get most people to accept it. While it might seem bad to overpay 5 keys to downgrade a 60 key hat, most of the time it is still worth it because you should be getting items that are much easier to trade. Technique number 4, upgrading. Now, as you can probably imagine from the name, upgrading is the polar opposite of downgrading, as you are essentially trading 2 or more of your unusuals for one of your trading partners. Most of the time, since downgrading is so good for everyone, I would honestly avoid against trading a lot of your hats into one more expensive one. However, there are still cases in which upgrading is good, with the best example of this being when you have 2 cheap hats that simply are not selling. If you can trade 2 hard to sell hats for one easier to sell more expensive one, it will often be worth it as long as you can trade for a hat that you think can actually get real offers on the classifieds. In addition, upgrading can often wind up being even better than you think because many people are often willing to overpay a number of keys on the sole basis of getting a downgrade. So utilizing this method can often be a win-win on many levels, especially if you want a more expensive unusual for a higher profit margin. Technique number 5, offering on Australiums or expensive non-unusual items. At this point in your trading career, you should know that pretty much all non-unusual items are basically pure keys in disguise simply because they have competitive buy orders. So a perfect way to get rid of your hard to sell hat is by offering it on expensive non-unusual items such as Australiums. Most of the time people aren't stupid enough to accept a 1-for-1 trade of equal value, but if you overpay even just a few keys, you can get a pretty awesome pure offer on your hard to sell hat. However, I do want to caution you to avoid just sending all of the Australium sellers on the classifieds equal value trade offers with your crappy unusuals. Almost 99% of the time, these sellers are experienced, and they're only really looking for pure or stupidly high overpay, so they will just flat out decline the offer and get angry at you. Instead, you should only really make these offers on people on trade servers or on your friends list, as these are the people that might actually take one of these offers. Now, at this point, I do think it is very important to warn you guys that these techniques don't work in all scenarios, especially if you overpay on an unusual and don't really upgrade tier very much. For example, if you overpay 3 keys with a skill gotten gains taunt to get a Mega Strike taunt, it probably isn't worth it at all. Yes, your new taunt technically has a better effect, but it will still sell quite poorly and now you just have a less expensive item. For this technique to really work, you absolutely must target unusuals that will not only get any offers just by sitting on the classifieds, but great offers, especially pure offers. In fact, in my opinion, getting unusuals that can sell for full pure or close to full pure is such an important facet to making profit in unusual trading that I'm going to devote the entire next trading strategy to it. Plus, as you guys can probably notice, this one is getting stupidly long as it is. Strategy number 3. Trading for unusuals that can sell for pure keys. I would rate this a 3 out of 5 difficulty, a 4 out of 5 profitability, a 1 out of 5 speed, and a 2 out of 5 risk. At this point, I'm gonna assume that you guys know the basics as to why pure offers are so insane. However, what you might not realize initially is how good they are with some of the overpaying methods that I talked about in the last strategy. You see, if you overpay on an unusual that often sells for full pure, it hardly matters how much you overpaid by to get it in the first place. For example, let's say that you buy a purple confetti familiar fez for 30% off or 21 keys. Now, in my opinion, the fez is pretty overpriced, and it would definitely be a hard sell. However, let's assume that you overpay an insane 6 keys for a smoking modest worth 24. You list the modest on the classifieds, and a week later you actually wind up selling it for 24 pure. Boom, you just made 3 keys profit right there. Of course, the trick here is finding out which unusuals commonly sell for pure. While there is no obvious secret to this, there are a lot of common patterns that you can find. For example, most cheap all-class hats that are less than around 30 keys like the modest sell for pure very frequently. The same is true for scout hats and soldier hats, a large percentage of unusual mists, as well as most sub 40 key hats with rare Halloween effects. Relatively inexpensive unusuals with effects such as burning, scorching, sunbeams, purple energy, green energy, and disco beatdown also sell for pure much more often, as they are very popular effects. Last, unusuals that are underpriced on backpack.tf are also great candidates as well. Of course, this doesn't apply to every unusual that sells for pure, so when in doubt, just go ahead and check the recent suggestions on the unusual in question, and if it has been documented selling for pure in the past, it definitely has a higher chance of selling for pure once again. Now that you know all of this, I would definitely recommend looking specifically for these unusuals on trade servers, and to make backpack.tf classified searches that specifically target these types of hats and effects. And if you follow the offering advice that I gave in the last strategy, you should be able to get your bad hats into potential pure items in no time. Anyway, that is just gonna about do it for the video. While it might seem weird that I only really talked about a few strategies in this video, each one required quite a bit of explaining, and I really did think it was necessary to talk about being proactive and non-proactive at the beginning. If you have any questions about the video or unusual trading in general, be sure to leave a comment in the comment section below. Join me next time where I'll talk about more trading strategies and when to use each one. Until next time guys, thanks for watching.